CEO Brian Thompson, net worth, a horror story. The night was thick with a silence that felt almost suffocating. The only sound that pierced the darkness was the low hum of the air conditioning in the room, an eerie mechanical sound that seemed too loud in such an empty space. The office, once gleaming with polished floors and sleek modern furniture, now felt more like a mausoleum than a place of business. Brian Thompson, CEO of one of the largest companies in the world, stood alone in his high-rise corner office. His back was to the windows, his eyes glued to the screen of his laptop, staring at numbers that didn't make sense, numbers that haunted him. The room was bathed in a soft, artificial glow from the desk lamp, casting long shadows that flickered and danced in the corners. Brian had always been a man of sharp instincts, a leader who had turned his company into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But tonight something was different. Something was off. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It had started slowly at first, a fleeting glance over his shoulder, the chill running up his spine when the lights flickered. But now it was growing, intensifying. His heart raced as the feeling crept closer, clawing at the edges of his mind, drowning out the noise of the city below. He could feel the pressure of his success weighing down on him, the weight of every decision he had ever made, every sacrifice he had ever had to endure. But it wasn't just the business that haunted him. No, it was something else, something far darker. He had heard the rumors, of course, the whispers that followed him through the hallways of his company, murmurs of strange occurrences in the buildings they owned, rumors of employees who had gone missing, never to be heard from again. But he had always dismissed them. He was the CEO after all. He was in control, always. He had everything under his thumb. But tonight, those whispers seemed louder, more insistent, and he couldn't ignore them any longer. As he turned his attention back to the screen, his eyes caught a flicker, a name that shouldn't have been there, a name that made his blood run cold. Thompson. The cursor blinked, mocking him. He refreshed the page, and it reappeared. Thompson. But this time, something was different about it. The letters weren't quite right. They seemed distorted, as though they were shifting, twisting on the screen. He tried to scroll away, but his hands froze, unable to move. His breathing quickened, shallow and erratic. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead as the words on the screen began to grow, expanding, stretching into something darker, something sinister. Suddenly, the door to his office slammed shut. Brian's head jerked up in shock. The room had become colder, much colder. His breath came out in small, misty clouds, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He could hear faint whispers now, soft, almost inaudible, coming from every direction. No, it couldn't be. It had to be his mind playing tricks on him. But even as he tried to dismiss it, the whispers grew louder, clearer, until they were no longer whispers, but words. Words he recognized. Words that belonged to the voices of those who had vanished. Brian. The sound of his name, spoken so clearly, so chillingly, made his blood run cold. He shot up from his chair, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers became a chorus now, their voices overlapping, the sound rising and falling like a wave crashing against his sanity. The cold was unbearable, and yet he couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. The words were still there, swirling, distorting. Brian Thompson. He backed away from the desk, stumbling over the chair, his mind racing. What was happening? Was this a nightmare? Was he losing his mind? He glanced at the door, but it was locked. His office was always locked at night. The windows were sealed tight, offering no escape. He had nowhere to run. His company, the empire he had built, the wealth he had amassed, it was all meaningless in this moment. Nothing mattered. Not anymore. He stumbled to the window, trying to force it open, but his hands trembled too violently to grip the lock. The room seemed to close in on him, suffocating him. His vision blurred as his mind raced, spinning out of control. That's when he saw it, the reflection in the glass, his face. But it wasn't his face. It was something else, something twisted. A figure stood behind him, its eyes hollow and dark, its skin pale and stretched tight over its skull. The reflection grinned at him, a malicious, toothless grin. Brian whipped around, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the emptiness of his office, the cold air biting at his skin. His mind was unraveling, and he knew it. But still, he couldn't stop himself from looking back at the screen. It was no longer just a name. It was a face now, staring back at him. His own face, but distorted, twisted in a grotesque expression of rage and fear. He had to leave. He had to get out of there. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as though the walls themselves had come alive, trapping him in his own prison. Panic set in. His chest tightened as the cold intensified, a biting frost creeping up his legs, his arms, his neck. His body trembled uncontrollably, his mind screaming for escape. And then, a sound, a soft, faint tapping, like fingernails against glass. The tapping came from behind him, just behind his left shoulder. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head. The figure from the reflection was there again, standing inches from him. Its breath was cold against his skin, its eyes empty voids that seemed to suck in all the light around them. It whispered again, but this time, it was different. The voice was deep, guttural, filled with a strange, otherworldly resonance. "Do you know the cost of your success, Brian?" The words hit him like a blow to the chest. He staggered back, his mind reeling, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching him, waiting. The air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and Brian felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his own guilt. The whispers, the tapping, the figure, all of it was connected to him. He had done something terrible, something that he couldn't remember, but the truth was clawing at the edges of his consciousness, and it wanted out. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, now accompanied by a low growl, like something dark and ancient stirring beneath the surface. The walls seemed to close in on him, narrowing until there was only darkness, total and absolute. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he saw the face of his former employees, the ones who had disappeared without a trace, floating in the shadows, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. His breathing grew erratic, and he staggered back to the desk, his hands trembling as they fumbled for the phone. He needed to call for help. He needed to tell someone, anyone, what was happening, but the phone wouldn't work. The screen flickered and went black, as though the world itself was rejecting his pleas for help. The figure stepped closer, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Do you know the price of greed, Brian? Do you know the price of your ambition?" Suddenly, everything fell silent. The whispers ceased. The tapping stopped. The figure vanished. And for a fleeting moment, Brian thought he had imagined it all. until he looked down at the screen. There, in blood-red letters, was a message. One final, chilling message. Your empire is built on death. The screen went black. The lights flickered. And then, nothing. Brian's eyes remained glued to the screen, the blood-red letters still haunting him, searing into his retina. His breath came in shallow gasps as the words, "Your empire is built on death," burned into his soul like a brand, a cruel reminder of everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed. His heart hammered in his chest, its rhythm erratic, wild. The office, once so familiar, had become a prison, an unholy realm of shadows and whispers. He tried to blink, to look away, but his body wouldn't obey him. His hands were frozen, clutching the edge of the desk, his knuckles white with strain. The chill in the air was unbearable now, creeping into his bones, gnawing at him from the inside. He wanted to scream, to shout for help, but his voice was trapped in his throat, caught somewhere between terror and disbelief. The whispers returned, but this time, they were louder, more urgent. They swirled around him, swirling through the air like a tangible force, each word laced with malice, with an intent he could not understand, but felt deep in his marrow. They seemed to come from every direction. No corner of the room was safe. No corner of his mind was untouched. "Do you know what you've done, Brian?" One voice hissed, so close it seemed to be in his ear. "Do you know the price of your ambition?" He jerked his head around, desperately searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, only the darkness. The shadows were thick now, stretching unnaturally across the room like dark tendrils, reaching toward him, closing in from all sides. His heart pounded harder, his chest constricting with the weight of the growing dread. "Everything you've touched," another voice whispered, colder than the first, "is stained with blood." His eyes darted to the door, the locked door that had trapped him here, but it was no longer the same door. The wood had started to warp, twisting, bending in unnatural ways, like it was alive, breathing, shifting with a will of its own. And then, from the gap beneath the door, a thin, black smoke began to seep out, curling up like tendrils of some ancient, malevolent force. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the room itself was closing in around him, squeezing the very life out of him. "Brian," the voice continued, now a chorus of many, all speaking in unison, "do you really think you can escape the consequences of your actions?" His legs felt weak, like they were made of rubber, his body trembling with a fear so intense it threatened to break him. His mind spun in frantic circles, searching for a way out, but there was no escape. There never had been. The coldness intensified, biting into his skin like icy daggers. He could feel the weight of the air pressing down on him, a force he could not escape. He tried to move, tried to push himself away from the desk, but his body refused to obey him. His fingers were glued to the wood, his muscles locked in place, frozen in terror. And then, something changed. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to come alive, twisting, contorting, as though they were being drawn to him, reaching for him, pulling him toward them. Brian screamed, a primal guttural sound that echoed through the empty office. But it was swallowed by the darkness, absorbed into the very fabric of the room. The walls began to pulsate, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting. He could feel the temperature dropping, the air thickening, until it was nearly impossible to breathe. His throat constricted, his chest tightening with each labored breath. The whispers had turned into guttural growls now, low and rumbling, like the sound of something ancient and hungry stirring beneath the earth. From the depths of the shadows, a figure began to emerge. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs long and spindly, stretching out of the darkness like a spider's legs. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Brian could feel its eyes on him, piercing through the blackness like burning coals. The air around it seemed to warp and shimmer, bending unnaturally, as if the very fabric of reality was being distorted in its presence. "Do you understand now, Brian?" The voice came again, this time from the figure, its tone a sickening mixture of pity and disdain. "Do you understand the true cost of your empire?" Brian's body quivered, his mind shattered into 1,000 pieces. He wanted to run. He wanted to escape. But his legs were like lead. His arms were frozen at his sides, unable to move, unable to escape the suffocating grip of the figure's gaze. The figure stepped forward, its long fingers reaching out toward him, cold and skeletal. As it neared, Brian could feel the air around him grow heavier, pressing down on him like a weight he could not lift. The darkness seemed to close in even further, swallowing the last remnants of light, leaving him trapped in a world of nothing but cold and shadow and whispers. "Your empire," the figure whispered, its voice a rasping hiss, "is built on death, Brian. And now, death comes for you." Brian's breath caught in his throat as the figure's hand closed around his wrist. The touch was icy, like death itself, sending a shock of cold through his entire body. The pain was immediate, sharp, like 1,000 needles piercing his skin, spreading through his veins like poison. His vision blurred, his knees buckling beneath him as he gasped for air. But the air was no longer enough. He couldn't breathe. The room was closing in on him, suffocating him, the darkness pressing down from all sides, the shadows swallowing him whole. The figure's hand tightened, and Brian felt something pull at the very core of his being, something dark and hungry, something ancient and evil, tearing at him from the inside out. He felt his soul being ripped from his body, dragged away, torn apart by unseen hands. And then, with a final, shuddering gasp, the world went black. Brian woke with a start, his chest heaving, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. His body was drenched in sweat, his hands trembling as they gripped the edge of his desk. He blinked, disoriented, the faint light of the office lamp flickering above him. His heart raced, pounding in his ears, as he tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it a dream? A nightmare? His mind raced as he looked around the office, but it was the same as it had been before. The desk, the laptop, the empty room, everything was normal. But something was wrong. His gaze flicked to the screen of his laptop, and his blood ran cold. The blood-red letters were back. "Your empire is built on death." It was real. It had never been a dream. It was happening. The whispers, the figure, it was all real. And now, the cost was coming due. The door to his office creaked open slowly, a sound so unnatural in the stillness of the room that it made his stomach churn. Brian's eyes widened in horror as he watched the door inch open, the darkness spilling in from the hallway. And then, standing in the doorway, was a figure, a shadowed silhouette, its face obscured, but its presence unmistakable. It wasn't over. It was just beginning. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent, as the figure stepped into the room, its steps slow and deliberate. The darkness seemed to follow it, curling around its form like a cloak. Brian's chest tightened as he realized with chilling clarity that the empire he had built was not just a product of his ambition, it was a product of death. And now, death had come to collect. Brian's mind spun wildly, a cacophony of panic, confusion, and desperation. His chest tightened, his body trembling, as he tried to force his legs to move, but they refused to obey. The figure in the doorway seemed to grow larger with every passing second, its presence suffocating, pressing down on him like an unseen weight. The shadows stretched, twisted, and coiled around it, moving in time with the figure's slow, deliberate steps. Each footfall echoed like a death knell, reverberating in the room and in Brian's soul. His breathing quickened, his vision narrowing, the walls of the office seeming to close in on him from all sides. His pulse hammered in his ears, drowning out everything else. But one thing was clear. There was no escape, no more running, no more hiding. The empire he had built, the wealth, the power, all of it had led him here, to this very moment where death, in its cold and relentless form, had come to collect what it was owed. The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid, almost inhuman, as though it didn't belong in the space, as though it was a creature from some twisted, parallel world. Its eyes, dark voids that seemed to devour light itself, met Brian's. He felt a chill creep down his spine, as if those eyes were piercing through him, seeing into the deepest recesses of his soul. And then, with a voice that was both ancient and guttural, it spoke, its words like ice scraping against his skin. "You thought you could build an empire on the backs of the fallen, Brian," it said, its voice low, like the rumble of thunder in the distance, distant but inevitable. But empires built on death crumble in the end. Brian tried to open his mouth, to scream, to beg for mercy, but no sound came. His throat was dry, constricted as if something invisible was choking the life out of him. His eyes darted desperately around the room, searching for anything that could help him escape. But the walls were closing in, the darkness overwhelming him, until there was nothing left but the figure and its cold gaze. "You took what was never yours to take," the figure continued, its voice now a deep, resonant growl. "The lives of those who worked for you, the lives you discarded like empty shells, they haunt you now, Brian. Their blood is on your hands, and now you will pay the price." Brian felt a sharp, violent tremor run through his body, as though his very bones were trembling in response to the figure's words. His mind raced, trying to grasp at something, anything that could explain what was happening. Was this real? Was he going mad? He had done terrible things, yes. He had made sacrifices, allowed people to fall to the wayside in pursuit of his own ambition, his own hunger for power. But this was something else. This was something beyond reason, beyond understanding. The figure stepped closer, and Brian could feel its presence now, like a cold wind that cut through him, freezing him from the inside out. He shuddered, his body convulsing, but still, he couldn't move. He couldn't break free. The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward him, and Brian felt a wave of dread wash over him, suffocating him. He tried to close his eyes, to block it out, but he couldn't. The hand closed around his wrist, cold as ice, its grip unyielding, and suddenly, Brian was pulled forward. His body lurched, his feet sliding across the floor, as if some invisible force was dragging him toward the figure. He struggled, trying to break free, but the hand held him fast. The darkness seemed to pulse around them, swirling and shifting as if alive, and the temperature in the room plummeted, the air growing thick and heavy, suffocating him. "You can't escape what you've become, Brian," the figure whispered, its voice now a rasping hiss, its breath cold against his ear. "There is no redemption for you, no escape." Brian's chest tightened, the air growing so thin that it was nearly impossible to breathe. His vision blurred, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out, but the grip on his wrist tightened, keeping him grounded in this nightmare. He could feel the weight of every bad decision he had made, every life he had crushed under the weight of his ambition, every person he had betrayed. And now, all of it had come rushing back, all at once. The whispers returned, louder than before, their voices like a chorus of the damned, calling out to him, accusing him, reminding him of the lives he had ruined, the promises he had broken. He could hear their voices, see their faces, all the people who had been caught in the wake of his rise to power, the employees who had vanished, the investors whose fortunes had crumbled because of his greed, the families torn apart by the consequences of his actions. They were all here, in the room with him, in the shadows, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. He wanted to scream himself, but the words stuck in his throat. The air was too thick, the weight of their judgment too heavy. He was drowning in his own sins. The figure leaned in, its breath cold against his skin, and whispered, "Do you see now? Do you understand the cost of your ambition?" Suddenly, the room seemed to shift, as if the very fabric of reality was twisting around him. The walls of his office melted away, replaced by something darker, more sinister. The floor beneath his feet gave way, and Brian fell, tumbling through the void, lost in an endless blackness. There was no sound, no light, only the sensation of falling, spiraling downward into an abyss. But then, just as suddenly, everything stopped. The darkness receded, and Brian found himself standing in an unfamiliar place. It was cold here, colder than anything he had ever felt before, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. The ground beneath him was uneven, cracked, like the ruins of some long-forgotten place. The buildings around him were nothing more than skeletal remains, their walls crumbling, their windows shattered. He could see the shapes of figures moving in the shadows, their forms too indistinct to make out, but their presence was undeniable. They were watching him. He tried to move, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. He was rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to escape. The figures in the shadows began to take shape, and as they did, their faces became clear. They were all the people he had wronged, the ones whose lives he had destroyed in his rise to power. They stood before him, their eyes empty, their expressions twisted in anger and pain. And behind them, looming like an ever-present shadow, was the figure, the one who had brought him here. The figure's face was no longer hidden. It was Brian's own face, distorted, twisted in a grotesque parody of himself. His eyes were hollow, his mouth twisted into a mocking grin. "You built this, Brian," it said, its voice now a sickening, mocking version of his own. "You created this world. This is the price of your empire. This is where you belong." Brian tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was raw, his body shaking uncontrollably. He wanted to run, to fight, to escape, but it was no use. There was no escape. There never had been. The ground beneath him cracked, splitting open, and from the abyss below, tendrils of shadow reached up, wrapping around his ankles, pulling him downward. His screams echoed in the air, but they were drowned by the voices of the people he had betrayed, the souls he had condemned. He was falling deeper and deeper into the darkness, into the very heart of the empire he had built on lies, on betrayal, on death. And as he fell, he understood. He understood that there was no redemption for him, no way to undo the harm he had caused. He had built his empire on the backs of the fallen, and now he would join them, lost in the shadows forever, condemned to suffer for the rest of eternity. The last thing he saw was the figure, his own twisted face, watching him fall into the abyss. And then there was nothing.